YouTube. Sorry, I'm a little late. Forgot.
Hello. Welcome to the OWASP DevSlop show. My name is Nancy Garche. I'm one of the hosts of DevSlop, OWASP DevSlop, and I'm here with my co-host, Tanya Janka, Nicole Becker, and special guest, Lana Ludge, special guest host, Lana Ludge, and also our main guest, Rajni Hatti. Hello, everyone. Hello.
Hi. Hey, guys.
So Rajni, let me see your bio. Rajni has a computer science degree from Cornell University and has worked as a software professional for over 20 years in a variety of industries, including telecom, finance, healthcare technology, and online fraud detection. She began her career as a software developer and gained a passion for testing, which led her to a focus on software quality and test automation. She then went on to start her own software consulting company, successfully driving projects from conception to deployment. Rajni currently works as a lead software engineer and test for Maxmind, an industry-leading provider of IP intelligence and online fraud detection tool. Hello, Rajni.
Hello.
Yes. So what do you have planned for us today?
So today I'm going to be talking about my experiences as a tester and working on the API Security Top 10 and finding ways to incorporate that into the things that I do every day as a tester.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to share? Oh, you actually already shared your presentation. Let me put that on. And let's get started.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for taking a little bit of time out of your day today to join me. As Nancy mentioned, my name is Rajni Hatti, and I work for Maxmind, and it's a company that's based in Boston, Massachusetts, and I am a lead software engineer in testing. I've been in the industry now for about 25 years, and in that time, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of changes in the way that we use applications just as a user, the way we actually interact with applications, and also from my perspective as a tester, someone on the development team, just the way that we actually go about actually creating applications and the way that we try to keep them secure. So this talk really was just inspired by my own process of trying to figure out how I fit in and how I can contribute to creating more secure applications. And so I hope to share some of the strategies with you, and I think even if you're not a tester, you could definitely use these ideas in your role in a development team. And as a tester, I kind of think of myself as the first user of an application. So we work really closely with developers, and so we're involved really early in the process. And the unique part of our role is also that we're also at the same time we're thinking as a user, we're kind of representing the user. And so I think using those two things in combination has been a great way to try to help my team and help to create better products, put better products out there, and especially from the security perspective, actually finding security vulnerabilities early is something that I think has been a good, a way that I can contribute in my role. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just a second. Okay, so I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about what API testing actually is. So there's actually different types of API testing. The part that I'm going to focus on today is called integration testing. And integration testing is a really great way to find security vulnerabilities because it mimics the way the API is going to be used in a real life scenario. And it mimics that request and response going back and forth. And so that, in conjunction with using the API Security Top 10, has been a way that I found I can really contribute to the projects that I work on as a tester. So before I jump in talking more about how I actually use the API Security Top 10, I want to just go over a little bit of the terminology that I'm going to be using in the presentation, and we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the terms I'm going to be using. And so on the left side of the diagram, you see a browser or an application. So a user is going to initiate some sort of action through the browser in the application. And that's going to generate an API call. And so the request is what I have here at the top. And the request is going to contain three things at a minimum. It's going to contain an authorization. The authorization could be something like an API key. It could be an OAuth authorization. And then it's going to contain a method. And the method is going to be, the examples I just gave here are get, post, or put. And that is the just telling the server, are we reading, are we writing, are we updating? And then we're going to have an endpoint. And the endpoint is going to have a URL. And the URL is really just a pathway, a path on the server is where we're trying to go to on the server. And it's typically going to also contain a query string. And the query string is just used for example, if I am trying to look up information about a particular user, I might need to supply the user ID or the username in order to actually complete the query in the database. So I have to supply that in my request. And then the request is processed, and then the arrow going on the bottom from right to left is the response. The response is going to have a status, and 200 is okay, successful. And then there's a variety of other types of error codes. I just gave 404 as an example. And then you're going to have a response body. And the body is typically in JSON format, and it is going to contain the results of our query. And then that is what the application can use to complete the user action. So that's kind of what integration testing is actually testing in a nutshell, these different aspects of the API call. And next, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I like to use this idea of integration testing along with the API top 10, security top 10 to start trying to detect vulnerabilities in my testing. So as a tester, the first thing that I look for and start thinking about at the beginning of a project is what should I be testing? And the reason that I want to do that is I want to focus my areas on areas of higher risk. And the reason I want to do that is if I identify areas of higher risk on my project, I can test those earlier and test those as early as possible and identify some of the high risk vulnerabilities at the beginning of the project, which is what I want to do, because it will be less costly, and take less time to fix things, security problems early. So the way I start my thought process is what I'm showing you here in this grid. And what I do is I start just thinking through my use cases for my application. So the examples I'm going to show you today are I'm using the Twitter API. And so I just picked out some really typical user scenarios on the left side here of things that people would try to do on a social media site. So I picked 4 different user use cases. And then along the top, I have the API security top 10, and those are the top, the 10 categories. And I'm going to talk more in detail about what each of those categories, some of those categories are later on in the presentation. But if you're interested in just learning more, I also have the link at the bottom of the slide to actually look at this document. And it has a lot of really useful information, especially the examples I found the most useful in the document of kind of ways that these different vulnerabilities can actually happen in an application. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely check that out. But anyway, for the purposes of what I'm doing here, I lay out my top 10. I have my use cases on the left side. And then what I start doing is I start looking at my risk in each of these categories. And so I look at risk in 2 different ways. And so I'm going to just take the example of on the very top row, the third to last column, I picked injection as a higher risk category for posting a status. So I want to explain a little bit of how I actually arrived at that conclusion. So injection is something where anytime you have user input, you can, a person that's has a malicious intent could put some type of malicious code or a JavaScript, put something in that user entry field that could actually hurt the system, potentially expose private data and things like that. So I want to pick, in this case, I'm thinking about the use case post to status. Well, that clearly is something where a user is inputting something. So my risk there, the chance of this particular vulnerability happening, of injection actually happening, is pretty high when I'm posting a status. The other aspect of risk that I look at is the risk of impact. So if this were to happen, how many people might be affected? So if there was some type of injection that happened, it could potentially release a lot of users' private information. It could even potentially even bring the whole system down. So a lot of people would be affected by this. So the risk of impact is also high. So that's why I coded that as red based on my analysis. And so I go through this process with all my use cases, and I look at each category, and I start color coding between red, orange, and yellow. And at the end of this process, I kind of have a guideline. This is not black and white. This may change throughout the process of the project, but I start out with a guideline, and I try to use the API Security Top 10 really early in this process, so that I've kind of identified the areas that I have high risk, and maybe I might want to add some more automated tests to cover those situations. Or I might even want to work with people outside the development team and just let them know, hey, this is a high risk area. Do we need some other types of, maybe we need a pen tester to be involved in this particular, to test this particular thing. So one of the benefits, the first benefit of going through this process on any project is that it helped me just define better what I want to test, but then it also helps kind of as a tester, be that glue that kind of connects developers and people outside of the development team to have those conversations about where are the things what could happen, what's the worst things that could happen, and what are we going to do about it. And so one of the ways that I've contributed, that I like to contribute as a tester, is to kind of be that conversation starter, and this is a great way to do that. So I don't want to just talk and talk and talk. I want to make sure that we have some time for interaction too. So I'm going to try, it's slides like these that are fairly complex. I want to make sure if there's any questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it's a question that's from me. I love this slide. I love the idea of going through this. Do you have a place where you've shared this online? Because this is brilliant.
I don't, but I can do that. I absolutely can do that. I actually can just do that on on the OWASP DevSlop. We can even do it right there if you want.
Yeah, we can. I could see so many people using this graph over and over again as a way to test requirements. It's brilliant. It's very methodical. I love that.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to share it. Yeah, that's definitely my purpose in this is.
Yeah, that's great.
Is sharing my.
So I have a question.
Success.
So when you're, sorry, I think my audio was a little delayed, but when you're assuming post user status, get a user's post, are you assuming that the API is kind of compliant with the method that makes sense for that sort of activity? Or do you have is there an element where you're all right, well, what if that post request is actually going over a put, or that delete is actually going over a get, or there's some sort of non-conformity of the API? Do you think about the problem in that way as well?
Yes, exactly. So for example, what the example you just gave is broken function level authorization, where someone might use a get, and someone might post something instead of getting something, and so that's something that that's kind of that is exactly the kind of thing that I would look at and think, that might be a potential weakness that I need to think about as I go through these use cases. So I'm going to actually have an example test that I'm going to talk about in a later slide that will actually kind of really address exactly the question that you're asking.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other people also commented that they totally love your chart and they can't wait to have a copy.
Oh, great.
Turned out I was not the only one covered in it.
Okay, well, we could definitely make that available. I will gladly share this.
So you can continue. Those are all the questions that were in the chat.
Okay. Great. So, so at the end of this process, this is something like what I end up with, and I have an idea of how I want to spend my time. What do I want to test first? And then this I kind of use as my guide to actually start designing out my tests and developing out the different kind of security types of tests that I want to do. So that's what I'm going to start going through the examples of next. So the next question that comes is, so from that first step of making that grid, the next thing I'm thinking is, okay, well, what test do I need? And so I always want to start out with my positive tests first, and I'm going to explain that in a second, but I just want to explain what I'm kind of my overall idea of what I'm doing here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of my scenarios, the 4 use cases that I had in the grid previous, the previous slide to this, and I'm going to kind of talk about what are the most important tests that I might pick for that particular use case based on what I've identified as a high-risk areas. So I'm going to show you 5 different tests, and I'm going to show you kind of how I think through that process. And these are really tests that could be even not necessarily just a tester. I mean, this is something a developer could definitely do as well, and could be automated as well. So what I started, so I mentioned I was using the Twitter API, and so I went to the developer's docs and I constructed my HTTP request to just post a tweet. And all I did was I, at the end of this HTTP request, you'll see where it says status equals, that's my query string. And I'm just saying this is a test, that's just my tweet that I made up. And so I mentioned that I always want to do my positive test first before I start getting into my security test. And by positive test, I just mean the good, the successful path. And the reason I want to start with that is because if that's not working, then there are some sort of bugs in the system. And then if I just jump straight into my security test and I'm expecting to say get a 404 error, and I might get that, but if there's still bugs in the system, I really don't know if I correctly got that error for the right reasons. And so I always want to do my positive test first and make sure that the good path, the successful path is working. So I did that. I used Postman, which is just an API testing tool that you can download online if you're interested. And I just put this request in and I sent it. I got my 200 OK status back. And then I went to the application and just made sure that my expected results were met. And it did post this tweet and it said this is a test. So we are good to go there. So now I'm starting to, after this, I started thinking about, okay, well, how can I start poking holes in this HTTP request? How can I start thinking like a hacker and thinking about the things, trying to exploit some of the weaknesses? And so I kind of use my chart that I made in the previous slide, the grid, and I start looking at my high-risk areas and think about tests that I could create for that. And so the first thing I notice is this 1.1. So this is the version number of the API. And so as you can imagine, version numbers are typically sequential. So this is actually something that if we don't secure older versions of our APIs, it could potentially be exploitable by someone who had malicious intent. And so what they could do, and this is called improper asset management, and what they can do is make a guess at what a previous version number is, and then they can use that. And if that particular version number wasn't made obsolete, if that has insecure, maybe it's not secured properly, it has old code, potentially a person could hack into the system that way. So based on that idea and this improper asset management, which is number 9 in the top 10, I came up with these 2 tests. And I go back a version. I also like to go forward a version because a lot of times you can have beta versions that are just available to the developers. And if they haven't been secured properly for some reason, and somehow someone to figure out that that version existed, they might be able to hack into the system that way. So I like to go backwards and forwards. And my expected result in this case would be a 404 not found. And so I went ahead and I tried that in Postman, and I sent that request, and I was able to get my 404. And so that test worked correctly. It was passed because I got what I expected. Are there any questions on this test?
No, everyone's being
Oh, it's
quiet.
clever. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're explaining it really well.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'll keep going. So my next test, I'm still on posting a status, posting a tweet. And the previous test I just made so simple. I just used text in my tweet, and I want to try to be a little more complex here, and I want to try a URL. So URLs are a very typical way of trying to hack into APIs, because you can add malicious JavaScript into the URL, and you could potentially, when someone clicks on that, if they saw it, it can execute that JavaScript and actually cause that code to run. And if it's malicious, it could cause a lot of problems. So I want to try just doing a link and see what happens. So I just do this is a link to the OWASP site, and I just write OWASP.org, and I put that in API in Postman, and I made sure I got my 200 okay, since this is a clean, valid URL. I wasn't expecting any errors. So I go on to the site, and I see that it posted the tweet, and it did something to the URL. I don't really know exactly, just from looking at this, what exactly happened, but I see that it turned it into a link, which is good. But I want to know more about what happened behind the scenes, because whatever parsing that it might have done, I want to make sure that if that had been a malicious URL, that it would have stopped that from being posted. So as I mentioned, I can't really see from the site what exactly happened. So I need to go to Postman, and I need to do a little more digging. And so I go to Postman, and this is just the response data that I look at in Postman. And you can see at the top right that I got a status 200, which means it was successful. And then I look more in detail at the response, and I see that it did do something to my URL. It posted OWASP.org on the tweet, but in the response, it shows me that it did do some sort of wrapping. And so I want to find out more about that. So I go to the developer docs, and I look at this t.co, and I'm trying to understand better about what it's doing. So one of the things that it does is it, as you know, there's limit to the number of characters in a tweet. And so a lot of links can be very, very long. And so in order to save you more characters, part of the reason that it wraps your URLs is that it can reduce the size of the URL, the number of characters. So that's one thing. And then the second thing it does is it parses your URL and makes sure that there isn't any malicious information, and there isn't any, anything that shouldn't be there. And so that's good. So this is doing what it should be doing. So this is a really important thing to look for when you're testing an API, is making sure that there is some sort of parsing that happens with URLs in any type of user input fields, because you want to avoid something like this, which is called injection, where if you see this post request that I have at the bottom, the part in red is, and this is just something that a test that I found online that kind of shows you what can happen. You can actually insert the script tags into a URL, and you can potentially cause a problem. So I wanted just to be sure. I know that it's doing some sort of wrapping, but I would want to make sure that. So I would do this test, and I made sure that you get a 400 bad request. And then sometimes even in the response, I don't think on the Twitter API did this, but a lot of times the API will give you more detailed information in the response about what the problem was. So you might look for that depending on API that you would be testing. So this is my security test for injection. That's number 8 in the top 10. Any questions on this test?
So when you get a 400, yeah, when you get a 400 bad request, what does that mean to you?
Right, and that's where I like to look in the response and see if it'll give me, a lot of times it'll give more details, because bad request is like a very generic kind of thing. And this is also why I like to do my positive tests, to make sure that the good positive way is working. So I know that it does definitely think this is a bad request, but I don't know what it thinks is bad about it. And that's where it just depends on the API, because certain APIs will give you more detail on the response and certain won't. But basically making sure that a good URL worked and a bad URL doesn't is a good test.
Cool.
Cool.
There's no questions in the chat.
Okay.
Sorry, I think my
Yeah, I think your video froze, but we'll fix that. Don't worry. Go ahead, Rajni.
Okay. All right, so now I'm on to my second use case, which was deleting a status, so deleting a tweet. And I go to the developer documentation, and I again construct my HTTP request, and I come up with this. And you'll see at the end of this request is this big long number. And the way I got that is that I have to find the tweet ID of what I want to delete. And so at the bottom here where my screenshot is, if you look in the URL, at the top of the screenshot, you can see a little bit of the URL. At the end of the URL, there's this long number, and that number is my tweet ID. So I take that from my tweet, and I append it onto this HTTP request. And I just make sure that when I send that in API in Postman, I get my 200 OK, and I go to the application and I make sure that that tweet got deleted. So we're all good on our positive workflow. And then now I can start thinking about my security tests. So again, I kind of use the high risk areas as my guideline. And so some of the tests that I start to come up with, the place that my eye kind of goes to first is this number. So IDs, just like version numbers, IDs can also be sequential. And so this is an easy way for people to exploit something, because they can guess if the IDs are sequential. A lot of applications purposely don't make them sequential for this very reason. But if they are, a person can easily guess what they are, and then they could potentially delete something, try to delete something that isn't theirs. And so this is called broken object level authorization. It's number 1 in the top 10. And to actually construct tests to test this, what I do is I take that ID number and I just pick, I mean, these are just two, but you can even do this automated and try a whole bunch of different numbers that are near the one that you know. But I just went back one and I went forward one. And I just want to make sure that both of those, since I don't have any tweets that have a tweet ID with those numbers, want to make sure that when I send those requests, that I also get my bad request. And then I remember when I did this in with the Twitter API, it also did give me more detail in the response, saying that that I don't have access, trying to access something that I don't have access to. So that was that kind of also confirmed that this API is doing what it should be doing.
No question for that test either. Go ahead, Tanya. Sorry.
No, I wasn't going to say anything. It just appears everyone is happy and we're listening.
Okay, good. That's what I like to hear. All right, so third test. So now I am, the past 2 tests, I focused more on my account and posting on my own account. Now I want to start looking at other people's accounts, and I want to start making sure that I can't do things that I shouldn't be doing to other people's accounts. So I'm going to just do something simple where I'm going to get another user's post. So another user's tweet. I'm just going to get their latest tweet. So I went to the OWASP account, the OWASP Twitter account, and I saw that this was the latest tweet. At that time, it was. And I found the ID for it in the URL, and then I constructed this HTTP request, and it's a GET request. And I just put in my query string, which is after the question mark, I just put my ID there, and I put the ID of this tweet, and then I just make sure that when I send that request, I get this particular tweet and the response, and that all looked good. So now I can move on to start looking at some of my security tests. So the first thing that I noticed with this particular test is that we're using a GET method. And GET means that we're just reading. And so another area that's really exploitable is called broken functional level authorization. and this is the fifth, number 5 in the top 10. And this is pretty simple to, it's simple to test, but it's potentially disastrous consequences if it is a vulnerability in your API. But it's simply just changing the method. And when you change the method, you want to make sure that the API has been secured so that we only allow the user to use the methods that are allowed for that particular endpoint. So in this case, I would try delete and I would try put. Put is just updating and replacing. So we want to make sure that if I try to do something like this and try to manipulate someone else's tweet, that wouldn't work. And so I did that. I got the 400 bad request, and then the response said something about that I have to use get or head, I think was what the response said. So I confirm that it does not allow me to use the wrong method. And that test was successful.
So we have a comment, but it's just that you're doing a great job and it's really very clear and easy to understand.
Oh, good. Great.
Please continue.
All right, so now my 5th test. Now I'm looking at getting another user's timeline. So the difference between the last test and this test is that I was just getting the latest tweet, and now I actually want to specify the number of tweets that I want to get back from the API. And so I'm just going to pick the last 2 tweets in this case, just to keep it simple. And so I construct my API request. It's also a GET request. And after the question mark, you see the query string. So I specified the screen name and I specified the count. And the count, I just said I want the last 2 tweets. So I put that in Postman and I get the response back and I see those 2 tweets. And then I see my 200 status, so I know that was all successful. So I'm good there. And now I want to start trying to pick this apart again and think about what can I do to break this. And so the first thing that jumps out at me is this count. So anytime we have something where we specify the number of something we want to get back, it's an area that can be exploited, because if there isn't rate limiting, which means a limit on the number of times I can do something and the number of records that I can get back at a certain time, it could make the system unresponsive if the number is so large and it's repeatedly sent, that request is sent over and over. And this is number 4 in our top 10, and it's called lack of resources and rate limiting. And so the example that I am using here is instead of 2, I'm going to try 200,000. And so what can happen if this actually were to work is that it might cause the overload the servers, and especially if I were to keep sending that request over and over and over, it could even make the API unresponsive. So I want to make sure that there's some rate limiting in place to keep me from doing that. And so I want to get a bad request when I do that. And when I did that, and I saw in Postman, it told me that that you can only ask for up to 3,200 of the most recent posts. So there is rate limiting in place with that API. So I was able to say that this weakness was not there. So that's good.
That's really good. I literally tell everyone constantly to turn on rate limiting, but also like quotas, so that someone doesn't just over and over again just ask for a little bit forever. Do you know what I mean? Like slowly they're just trying to take the little bit of information, and everyone's like, really? I'm like, yeah, people are probably abusing the crap out of your APIs and you're paying a giant bill because of it.
That's right. Right. Yeah. Even with sign-on is another area that's really susceptible to rate limiting, where you can do a brute force attack where you could like constantly keep trying different usernames and passwords. So usually that's another place where I would look for rate limiting. Say, okay, typically after 3 to 5 attempts that it should lock you out for a certain amount of time. So that's another place that you would look for this weakness.
Thank you for telling everything that I tell everyone all the time. I really appreciate another person saying this.
Good.
Okay, I'll stop interrupting. Keep going.
Okay, so that kind of covers my 5 tests, and I try to pick tests that really could be used on any API. So I think that you could probably take any of these tests and try this on any API, and it would be a really good thing to try to test. So I try to focus on that. There are probably countless other tests that you could do with this. The idea behind it was to just show you the thought process that I go through of how I decide how to kind of poke holes in things as a tester, and how that idea really could apply to really anyone on the development team, because it's just a matter of kind of having that awareness of what to look for. So to wrap up, I just wanted to say a little bit about when I started this presentation, I mentioned that part of the inspiration was just trying to figure out how I can contribute as a tester. And so just through my experiences, I've kind of narrowed down some of the things that I think that we all could be doing to help make our applications secure. And I kind of named that my 3 L's. And the first L is to listen. And so as you can see from the picture, listening is also about collaborating. And when I started out researching more about, years ago, when I started kind of learning just more about what is security testing, I didn't really know that much about it. It was overwhelming because there's just so much information, and it is a very complex topic. And so I kind of came to the conclusion after some time that one person really can't just know everything. It really does take working with other people on your development team, other people in your company, to really kind of think about what are the areas that are weak in our applications and how could we hack into our own application. So kind of like an ethical hacker kind of mentality, where one of the things I found really useful that I've done before is like a tabletop exercise where we had a group from different areas of the company and just started thinking about a scenario. We just were given a scenario and thinking about, okay, if this particular hack happened, what would we have in place to mitigate it, and how would we deal with potential consequences? And just that listening and collaboration, I think, is an easy way that any of us can contribute in our jobs, really just on a daily basis, just the meetings that you're going to already. I think you could contribute whatever you know from thinking like a hacker. So I think listening is really, really important. And then second is to learn. So learning, like I mentioned, this is a very complex topic. There's a lot of information out there. What I find has worked for me is just pick an area that I personally am interested in, and I have just like personal interest in. And API testing for me was just one of those things because I've had to do it a lot, and I just picked one small part of the whole security landscape and kind of just try to learn about that. So OWASP is a great resource. There's so many other resources out there, even just blogs and articles. So I encourage everyone to just think of pick something that you actually have an interest in and just learn a little bit about that. Maybe, just devote 15 minutes a day for it for a week and just learn a little bit about something new. And I think that is, although it seems small, you will contribute a lot just by keeping up to date with what all is out there. And so that is kind of my second way that I feel that we all could contribute. And then lastly is to look. So that seems kind of obvious, but as a tester and as a coder, as a developer, we're in the code a lot. And I know when I started out learning more about security testing, I really wasn't sure what I was supposed to be looking for. And I wasn't sure if it was really more the responsibility of an automating tool, or maybe we had one of the companies I worked for had a special team that was really focused on security. So I wasn't really sure if I would just be duplicating other people's effort. And I realized that as testers and developers, because we are in the code so much and so early, that it's really important for us to look for vulnerabilities, to look for problems. And when you listen and you learn, you support your ability to look for things just in your daily job, just as you're doing your work, looking for these problems. There's this idea of see something, if you see something, say something. And I think it's easier to do that if you you're kind of having awareness of the type of vulnerabilities that could happen. So those are 3 things I think we all could probably do. And I feel like I try to just incorporate that into my daily work instead of feeling like I have to spend all the separate time on learning about these things. So I hope that can help all of you as well.
This has been great. I like you encouraging everyone to learn and do all the things.
Thank you very much.
I also like that you're taking this from the tester perspective as opposed to the penetration tester perspective, if that makes sense. Like every tester can test these things with the way that you so clearly laid them out. Are your slides available online anywhere so that people who were here and liked it? Okay, cool. Because we should.
Yeah, actually, yeah, they're not available online right now, but I can. We can maybe just post them along with the other grid that we were going to post the third slide that I showed.
That would be awesome. I think a lot of people would really benefit from them and like watching this again. Ooh, look, a question.
You want to go ahead? Go ahead, Tanya.
Okay. So Security Grit asks, is testing Windows APIs on a host a similar methodology or different? When I say Windows APIs, I'm thinking of non-web URI. And also, I'd love to see an intro to Postman if you even ever had time. So I don't
backlog for the show.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it really should work really similarly. I kind of because the example I showed was a social media site, it just made sense to have a web front end. But really, you are correct in that really any API, even if it doesn't have a front end, can work in the same way. Because integration testing is just ultimately testing the request and response going back and forth. And Postman will do that for you regardless of if you have a UI component or not. So all these concepts would apply to that as well. And as far as Postman, I haven't ever given an intro to it. I think the way I learned it was really just going online and looking up tutorials, but hey, maybe that'll be another talk I can do.
Well, here's a follow-up question. Do you plan your learning so that it builds on itself? How do you decide what to learn?
That's a great question. I think I think that I started out feeling like I needed to learn everything, and I realized very quickly that it's not possible, and it's also frustrating and it can get boring. So I at some point took a turn and said, I'm just going to focus on the things that I find interesting, and maybe I'm not going to know everything about everything, but I'm just going to know a little bit. I'm going to know a little something, but I'm going to know it really well. And like for me personally, I really enjoy doing the research for these talks because I learn so much. And so part of why I do this, what I do, is because I enjoy that process of learning that I get, all the work that I've done before I get here. And so I think that just finding something that you're interested in, and if you're not even sure what you're interested in, just there's a lot of blogs out there that I think people make a little bit more interesting than sometimes like the real technical stuff gets a little dry. And I just like reading articles, and I find, there's certain bloggers that I think try to make it more simple. And so I really think you have to use your own inner kind of interest and passion to decide what to learn.
Fair enough. I think that's all I have from the chat.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, great.
Hey,
no, I just wanted go ahead.
One more quick question.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry,
Nicole.
Yeah. So just in terms of API documentation, how do you utilize all the documentation that may or may not exist in the, I don't know, developer's guide, or, do you utilize that in any of your testing?
Yeah, if, I've worked on projects that it's still so early that the documentation doesn't exist yet. And in that case, I just try to kind of work with my developers and figure it out that way. But I like documentation, especially for APIs, because I think it also forces you to think through areas that you might have missed. So I think that I try to use it as much as possible, because a lot of times I feel like I end up testing the document too, because sometimes there's mistakes in the document. And so combining my regular testing and comparing what's in the document, I kind of can get both in line with each other. So I like to use documentation a lot.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. I really like practical application of the top 10. I think that's super great because a lot of people look, oh, do I need to memorize the top 10? Actually, I want you to know how to find and stop those things from happening. Don't really need you to memorize the list. Just, yeah. And then you could use these tests for lots of your apps, and then you could teach all the other QA members on the team how to use the tests. And then I love the idea of like doing the work once and then automating it or adding it to all the other things. Like I love that. Practical use, efficiency, effectiveness. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And that's kind of that's usually what I do. I first do it manually just to kind of get through it and find stuff quick. And then we eventually will add it into our automated testing.
It's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Where's Nancy?
I'm right here. There's
She's
great.
here.
I'm reading the comments and sharing them with you. Rob saying thanks, very clear presentation. And I just wanted to share for people that are in the chat. You might not see it if you're watching this after, but we have a habit now to do a giveaway for each shows to encourage people to join us live. And we've partnered with Avatao. I don't know if you're familiar. Anybody familiar with that platform?
Yeah, I know them.
Yes. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Basically, they teach developers security lessons. So they have like .NET, Java, etc. And it's kind of like lessons where you interact with it and it teaches you the secure code way to do the thing. It's pretty cool. Absolutely. It's so nice of them to sponsor this episode and give away a gift to our viewers.
Yes. So yes, we're giving a spot on, we have an organization for DevSlop where you have access to all their training for the language of your choice. We don't, we're vendor neutral, but they are a sponsor and we're happy to give it away to one of our listeners. And today I have a winner and it is Kent McPherson. So Kent, I'll be contacting you very soon and giving you all your access information to have access to the platform. And please give them feedback on their platform and happy learning. That's what I had for that. And I also wanted to say that for our next show is in 2 weeks on August 12th. And we are having Ken Johnson and Seth Law from Absolute AppSec Podcast. And they're going to give us a presentation on secure coding reviews, so secure code reviews with Seth and Ken. So that should be an interesting show. So please don't miss that and join us. Subscribe to the channel and set your notification to be notified when we go live. And that's what I had. What else? Okay, so maybe a final roundtable before we say goodbye. Lana, I haven't introduced you very fully in the beginning of the show, but I like to bring you in as a guest host when we're talking about web development because that's what you do, and to ask relevant questions and to see if you can learn any takeaways from today. You're on mute right now, but
thanks. Yeah, I was very quiet this time. It was all very comprehensive. I've used Postman before, so it was pretty clear to me. I don't know. I really like the chart. I really like assessing it completely, and that way you don't, because I find when you're looking at things like this, you can kind of get in, like if you were just looking at access control or one kind of thing, you might just forget about all the other areas. So good to like have a roadmap first. I think that's pretty cool.
Perfect. So that's it for today. We're at almost an hour in. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you, Rajni, very much. Thank you for your work in the clear presentation. It was clearly appreciated. And see you all in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you, Rajni.